Hey, Wes here again. So I hope you're enjoying the course so far. I realize that it's probably a lot all at once, especially if you are developing for the first time in .NET or doing web development for the first time. So I just thought we'd take a short break here and talk about a few of the concepts that were mentioned over the course of the first several videos, because these will come up again and again and hopefully become more familiar as we build this application. So the first concept I'd like to talk about is the model view controller pattern. And so as you've seen, when we set up our web template with ASP .NET Core MVC, we have a few different folders in our web project, namely the controllers, models, and views. And so these three concepts sort of represent three different responsibilities that our web layer has. So the first is this idea of our views. And so views you can think of as what the user ultimately sees, so your web page. And so you'll notice we'll be creating some files with the CS HTML extension. And what these are essentially markup files, HTML files with a templating view engine in them called Razor. So when we use the @ sign, or you may hear me say spiral, that is a sort of signifier to the Razor templating engine that within that particular block of code signified by that @ symbol is where we'll actually be more or less writing something like C#. And so we'll use that to dynamically generate the content on these views. So the next thing you might ask is, okay, well, what are we populating these views with? And the answer to that is our view models. And so that will be the M in MVC. And so we have these sort of very simple C# objects that represent our view models. So we might have different view models for things like, say, our create a new post page, or for the forum index. And it's the responsibility now of the third part of MVC, our controllers, to actually take data that it receives from our service layer, which in this case is interacting with our SQL database, take those entity models and then push them in a sense into our view models so that they can be presented down to the page. So the controller really takes care of all of that logic. So you'll definitely get a sense for how these three principal components of this web layer pattern work together over time. But yeah, you can just kind of keep in mind that your views are what the user sees and interacts with. Your models are your representation of data that you're presenting to those users in the view. And then your controller is what's doing all of the logic of receiving some value back from the service layer and then pushing it down via some view model into your view. So I hope that sheds a little bit of insight anyway into the way that the MVC pattern is implemented in ASP.NET Core. And so the next thing I want to talk about is our data layer. So you may hear me talk about entity models or domain models perhaps. These are sort of the central conceptual objects in our system for which we have tables in our database and for which we have models in our data layer. So these are distinct from our view models in the web layer in the sense that our view models, we can have many view models that essentially just represent the structure of the data that we want to present to the user in some view. But our domain models really represent the main concepts in our system. So things like forums, posts, users, these sorts of things. And so you've noticed that in this project, we're doing code-first database migrations. And what that means is that we are essentially creating classes in C# that our ORM, in this case Entity Framework, will then parse and essentially generate scripts to create a database schema. This is distinct from database-first design, in which case you would actually build out your SQL first and create a database. And then Entity Framework, in that case, would look at your database and generate C# classes from it. That was more often the way things used to be done. Now, certainly in .NET Core, we work in a code-first fashion. And so we define all of our models in code, and then our database schema is generated from those classes. So anytime we want to make an update to our schema, we can modify the models that we have represented in our data layer and run update database on that project. And any framework will, kind of diff what we've done and then generate a migration file. And that migration file sort of acts as a kind of trail, in a sense, of all the changes that we have made to our models during that particular migration. And so we'll have a series of migrations over time that we can, in a sense, understand the state of our schema changes as the application evolves and as we update or change our schema. Okay, so that's about all I have for now. I hope you are hanging in there. Again, if this is the first time that you've done web development, this is all going to be kind of a lot of new concepts, and perhaps it won't all make sense at first, but if you stick with it, you'll start seeing these patterns kind of repeat themselves over time throughout this application as we build it, and hopefully you'll start getting a better sense for how things are working. So I hope you're hanging in there, and I'll catch up with you again here in a few videos. Okay, so we're actually hitting a breakpoint that we must have set earlier here on the home controller. We can Control-Shift F9 to delete all breakpoints in our solution. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And we'll head back here. And I'll just hit continue, and then we'll hit back to the page. Okay, and looks like we have a little error to fix here where it's saying, again, it's missing this application user. So let's minimize this, and we're going to head down into our shared views here, and let's just check out, for instance, our layout. So that looks good. Our login partial, which appears to be missing our application user. So we're just going to fix the using here at lambdaforms.models. We actually moved all of our entity models, including our application user, into the data layer. So that's now lambdaforms.data.models. And let's go ahead and check on the validation scripts partial for good measure. We don't see anything there, and in the error as well. View imports and view start. So it looks like those particular namespace issues are resolved. Let's go ahead and come back here, and I'll refresh the page. Okay, so that's looking good. Now we need to head to the forum index that we just worked on. So we'll just visit it at forum/index. And what I'm going to do before we visit this URL is to actually set a breakpoint in the code. So we'll come back here, and we're going to go into the forum controller. And I'm going to set a breakpoint here, in my case on line 21, at the index action. And then we'll visit /forum/index. Okay, and you can see that we're getting an exception here where it's saying it's unable to resolve a service for type lambdaforms.data.iForum while attempting to activate the forum controller. That's because I forgot to actually map the forum service to our iForum interface as the concrete class that we'd like to actually implement when we inject this iForum dependency. So we actually do that in the startup file, and we're going to go ahead and stop the server. And we do it inside of this configure services method. So I'm just going to do it right here underneath this services add transient, and we're just going to add a scoped service. So we'll say services.add scoped. And for our types here, we'll have an iForum, and then the particular service that we'd like to implement iForum when we do our dependency injection will be our forum service. And so what we're going to need to do is to add a reference to our service layer here in our web layer. So what we're going to do is go ahead and right click on the web layer and add a reference to our service layer. Say OK. And now we'll control period on forum service and bring in the using for that service namespace. And so now our dependency injection will actually work because Entity Framework is going to configure our services and say, hey, anytime a class, such as our controller class here, is going to ask for an implementation of these forum actions, to go ahead and use this forum service that we've written. So that actually gets defined down here in our startup class. This is kind of neat because we could configure it to use completely other types of concrete implementations here, depending on what configuration of our application we're actually running. And we wouldn't need to actually change anything in our controller so long as this concrete class implemented the interface that we defined. In our case, we just have a single implementation of it, this forum service. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start the server back up. And now we'll go ahead and visit /forum/index again. And so now we're hitting our breakpoint here. And so we're going to hit F10. This is actually going to step through this method. So we'll hit F10 once. And so this is where we're going to invoke our forum service to get all of the forums back from our database, which is currently empty. And so if we hover over forums, we'll see that it is basically the enumeration yielded no results, is what we expect right now. And so forum list is just going to be this empty list. And we're going to go ahead and hit F5 to return our view model. And so we have a simple page here, but we don't have any forums to show. So what I'd like to do is to go ahead and seed our database using some SQL inserts here to actually create instances of our forums. So if you open up SQL Server Management Studio, and be sure that you're running queries against the database that we just migrated earlier. And so we're going to go ahead and right click on it and say new query. And we'll close this old file here. And so let's just select star from forums, which is going to be empty for right now. And so you can see our properties here are now these columns that we have. This is what Entity Framework generated for us using the code first approach. And so what we're going to do is just write an insert statement here. So we'll say insert into forums. And now we just want to provide a created on date, a title, and a description. And even though it's not necessary, SQL's recognizing this description as actually a keyword, so we can wrap it in square brackets to specify that we mean the description column here, and then an image URL. Okay, and then we're going to insert some particular values here. And so we'll insert get date to get the current date when we make this insert. And let's go ahead and create some forums. So I'm just going to type these out really quickly and create a couple different coding forums here for us. So we'll just create 5 or 6. So we'll create a Python forum and give it a quick description here. And then for an image URL, we're actually just going to pass a relative path to an images directory that will actually populate here in a few minutes. So we'll just say /images forum/py.png here. And I'm going to go ahead and insert several more forums here as well. And I'm going to scroll out a bit so we can fit more of it on the screen. And we'll go ahead and create a C# forum. And we'll have an image at cs.ping for that. And maybe we'll have 2 or 3 more here. One for JavaScript. And maybe one for Go here. Now we're actually just going to insert this data into our database. And if we hit F5, we can go ahead and do that. And you can see 5 rows are affected. So now if we just select star from forums, we can see that we have records for 5 different forums that we just created. So we'll go ahead and minimize this. And if I just refresh the page here, we'll hit our breakpoint again. And if I F10 once again through this, and then I hover over this forums variable here and expand it, and we expand the results view, you can now see that we have 5 different results that are getting returned. And if we expand any one of those, we can see their properties. So it's pretty cool. So now I'll go ahead and just hit F5. And now on our page here, you can see that we're actually returning this data back from the database. And even though we have more data that we could potentially display in the database, because the way we have told our controller to actually package that data, if you will, into our view model here, we're actually just displaying the name and the description. And in fact, we're also passing the ID down to the view, but we're not using it yet. So let's look at how we might use this ID property. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize the browser for right now, and then go down into our view. So I'll expand the Solution Explorer, and we'll take a look at our forum index.cshtml. And now what I might want to do is wrap this forum name in a link so that when we actually click on any one of the titles of our forum, we can go to a sort of forum detail or forum topic page. So for that, we're going to use some ASP tag helpers here. So we'll start an anchor tag, and then we'll say ASP-controller, and we'll use the forum controller, and then ASP-action, and let's go ahead and use an action called topic. We could also call it detail, but since each forum sort of represents a particular topic, then that's what I like to call it here. And finally, we'll use this ASP route-id is equal to our @forum.id. Okay, so we'll go ahead and close that tag, and now we'll just move this forum name here up into the anchor tag. Okay, so just so you can see that a little bit better here, we've created a link, and then we're using these tag helpers here to basically tell our view how to generate this particular link. And so what it's going to do is it's going to construct our route now using forum as our controller and topic as our action, and then just passing this ID as the route value to pass to our topic action. So we can actually just save this, and then if we revisit our page here and refresh, actually go ahead and get rid of our breakpoints for now as well. So we'll just continue. You can see that we have links now, and if you look down at the bottom of the browser where we can see where these links are going, we've got the actual ID coming after the topic action in our URL now. And that ID is of course corresponding to the ID property, which is on each of these forum listing model objects, which of course maps back to our primary key on the forums table. So you can see Python here is the first row and C# is the second row, and those have IDs of 1 and 2 respectively, and you can see that that maps directly to our database as well. So I think that leads us kind of naturally into wanting to create the topic action on our forum controller now. So we have our index action. I'm just going to go ahead and collapse that for the time being, and we'll stop the server of course. And we're going to create a new action result here for our topic now. And so our topic action is now going to take that ID parameter, which corresponds to the primary key on any of our forums. So if you recall, like /1/2 corresponding to the different forums that we have here. So that's what this ID represents. And so how are we going to actually get back the particular forum that corresponds to that primary key? Well, we're going to use our forum service again. And rather than actually getting all of the forums back, we're going to get a particular forum back by its primary key. And we have a method for that. So we'll save our forum, and we'll again invoke our forum service here. And now we'll use this getById method and pass it the ID that we pass our controller action. And so now we actually need to populate this getById method on our forum service. So if we F12 here, we'll actually head over to the interface, which isn't going to be useful to us. This is just where the methods are defined. But I'll clean up the namespacing anyway. And we'll head over into our forum service, the concrete class. And so we'll look for this getById method. And we'll go ahead and remove the default exception. And we'll go ahead and create a variable to store the forum that we're going to return here. And so we'll look in our DB context for all of our forums. And now we're going to just use a where clause. And for this, we'll need to actually bring in link. So I'll control period to bring in link. And we're just going to specify where the forum ID is equal to the ID that we pass this method. And in fact, we're going to need to call that something different because forum is the name of our variable. So I'll just abbreviate it as F. And just as before when we included posts, I'd like to also include posts here. So we'll call .include f.posts, and that way we'll be actually eagerly loading our posts now. And then we can actually use this then include, because our posts have navigation properties on them as well, for instance the user. And we'll call include once again. This goes back to our base collection of forums, and we'll include posts again in order to get the replies off of those posts. And this then include, I'm going to name the delegate P here because this is actually off of our posts here. And in fact, I'll do some indentation here as well to kind of illustrate that. Oops, and here, obviously I meant to collect the replies. And in fact, our replies also have navigation property on them of user. So what we're going to do is call then include again, and this is going to allow us to include the reply user as well. And then we can actually just return the forum that we collected here. And of course, we need to call .first, or first or default anyway, here on this collection. So this is link actually just saying, give me the first forum that corresponds to this where clause that we've constructed here. And in this case, since we're building a where clause on a primary key, we should only ever expect that to return a single result. And so we can safely call first or default here and be sure that this query only will ever correspond to a single record. Okay, and I'm just gonna format this a little bit differently as well. I'm not sure which way it would be easier to read, but I think I kind of like this syntax even though it is a bit long. So we're looking in our forums for the forum corresponding to the primary key that we pass this method, and then we're going to make sure that we include the post navigation property and the user navigation property on those posts. And then we're also going to be sure that we include replies from posts and the user who made the reply on each of those posts. And then we're going to call first or default to make sure that we just return a single instance of a forum rather than a collection of forums. Okay, so we'll go ahead and implement this method now in our controller in the topic action.